We have seen so far, among other things, that naturalism and naturalistic evolution cannot account for the development of new organs, forms, functions, or organisms. It can't account for abstract universals such as the laws of logic, truth. Um, it can't account for mind, and it cannot account for consciousness and morality. But behind that, naturalism cannot account for life itself, because according to naturalism, life had to have arisen from non-living matter. But Michael Denton points out that a living cell and the most highly ordered non-biological system, such as a crystal or snowflake, between them there is a chasm as vast and absolute as it is possible to conceive. Recall in a previous lecture, Michael Behe's study of the cilia and flagella within the cells show that cells are not primitive or simple, but are incredibly complex construction systems. Despite their tiny size, each cell amounts to like a micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery. And they're all, as we have seen, basically computer-like in their function. They're all based on information. Now, geneticist William Stansfield says that there are two basic ideas concerning the origin of life. Number one, that life is produced from non-living components of the environment by natural processes. That's the theory of spontaneous generation, and that's what naturalism has to hold to. The other view is that life is produced by supernatural powers, the theory of special creation. That is what the Bible posits. Now, Sir Fred Hoyle, who formulated the theory of stellar nucleosynthesis, wrote that the combinatorial arrangement of not even one among many thousands of biopolymers on which life depends could have been arrived at by natural processes here on Earth. And he concluded with this example. He said, imagine 10 to the 50th blind persons. 10 to the 50th power is 100 billion trillion blind persons. Now imagine all those blind persons, each with a scrambled Rubik's Cube, and try to conceive the chance of them all simultaneously arriving at the solved form of the Rubik's Cube. That's the chance of arriving by random shuffling of just one of the many biopolymers on which life depends. In other words, it is physically impossible for life to have arisen out of non-living matter by naturalistic means. Now, remember also, we talked in an earlier lecture about DNA, and of course, it's DNA and the genetic systems upon which life is based are all computer-like digital information storage and replication systems. In other words, information is of fundamental necessity for life to exist. And furthermore, the information must be functionally specific. And so, as David, science consultant, Dr. David Foster notes that the specificity of the DNA of the T4 bacteriophage is represented by the number 10 to the 78,000th power, so that there is only one chance in 10 to the 78,000th of its actually occurring by random shufflings. Now, he says those figures have to be set against the fact that the universe is only 10 to the 18th power seconds old. And so there is no possibility whatsoever of life having evolved through Darwin's theory of natural selection operating on chance mutations. In fact, The underlying problem is even for naturalism is even greater than the above facts indicate, because even the simplest cell employs the same genetic code and the same mechanisms of translation as do human cells. Now, the genetic code embodied in DNA, is meaningless unless translated. But the code can't be translated otherwise than by products of translation. In other words, the DNA contains instructions an organism needs to develop, live, and reproduce, but it cannot operate unless it is fully formed and functional. And therefore, we can't even begin to guess how DNA could have come into existence in the first place on the basis of naturalistic processes. Karl Popper puts it like this: what makes the origin of life and of the genetic code a disturbing riddle is this: the genetic code is without any biological function unless it is translated. That is, unless it leads to the synthesis of the proteins whose structure is laid down by the code. But the code can't be translated except by using certain process products of its translation. It's a vicious circle. And so, again, naturalism cannot possibly, on any scientific or chemical, physical process, account for the existence of life. So with that being true, why do so many scientists hold to naturalism? The former evolutionary biologist, Richard Lewontin, he had been the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Zoology and Professor of Biology at Harvard University. He said this: he is a naturalist. He is, so far as I know when he was alive, an atheist. And yet, what did he say? Lewontin says this: our willingness, namely the willingness of naturalistic scientists, to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories. In other words, it just happened to happen this way. Because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science themselves compel us to accept a materialistic explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori, in other words, we believe this in advance, we believe materialism in advance of or before all the evidence. We are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. What he's saying is so clear that they accept materialism and naturalism in the face of, in spite of all the evidence, because their commitment in advance to materialism is so absolute, they cannot allow for the prospect of a divine foot in the door. Namely, they will not admit that God is the true creator of life. Now, all of this being said, even behind the issue of how life grows is how anything exists at all. In other words, naturalism cannot account for the existence of the universe. Martin Heidegger called "why is there something rather than nothing" the fundamental question of metaphysics. And again, evolutionists William Stansfield admits that, quote, science cannot account for the primary origin of matter or energy, end quote. And so Nobel Prize winner Peter Medawar said, by its very nature, the question of how everything began cannot, even in principle, be answered by science, since there can be no empirical awareness of nothingness, so that if any such frontier between being and nothingness exists, it cannot exist in the domain of science. But nevertheless, scientists have done their best to try to come up with some materialistic explanation for why anything exists at all. Now, in the 1970s, Stephen Hawking, Roger Penrose, and George Ellis demonstrated that the universe had to have begun at a finite point in time, beginning from nothing temporal or nothing material. This is known as a singularity. In other words, the point of time which is said to begin the laws of begin existence, and beyond which the laws of physics cease. Now, beyond that point, of course, we cannot reason at all, because we have no idea what nothing is like. But what they're saying is that there was a point when there was nothing, but then something spontaneously somehow came into existence on its own. Now, the predominant view that the universe came into being like that is called the Big Bang theory, which says that the universe as we know it started as an infinitely hot and dense single point that inflated and stretched first at unimaginable speeds over the last 13.8 billion years. Now, since the Big Bang theory was developed, there have been refinements of it, and today there are things called, the latest development of which is called M theory, which is advocated by Stephen Hawking, which predicts that, says that multiple universes were created spontaneously out of nothing. And he says, because there's a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing. Doesn't sound very scientific to me, but that is what they believe, because, as Lewontin said, they cannot allow a divine foot in the door. And Stephen Hawking was very explicit about the theological reason behind his theory. He said that so long as the universe had a beginning, we could suppose it had a creator. However, if the universe is completely self-contained and has no boundary or edge, then it would not have a beginning, but would simply be. Now, Hawking's no boundary proposal cannot be deduced from any fact of existence, as Hawking himself admitted. Furthermore, it can't be deduced from the laws of science, because the laws of science are those which we know, which came out of the Big Bang, if you believe in the Big Bang. And so we can't hope to know what things were like before the Big Bang. Such speculations are no better than the Bible's claim that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Hawking admitted that he used what he called imaginary time to come up with his proposal, because he said that only in imaginary time are there no singularities or boundaries between space and time. But in real time, he admitted, the universe has a beginning and an end at singularities that form the boundary between space and time. So, in short, the proposal that he is making is as imaginary as the imaginary time he used to propose it. Third, he says that the universe comes as a result of the scientific laws, such as the law of gravity. But that is what is known as a category error, because causes and scientific laws are not the same thing. Causes are events that precede other events and act upon them in such a way to produce an effect. A law, on the other hand, does not cause anything, but simply explains why things happen. For example, the law of gravity and the laws of science do not cause space, energy, or anything else to come into existence, but simply describe how they interact with each other once they already exist. Now, and more fundamentally, David Darling, who was former dean of the College of Education at the University of New Mexico, points out the sleight of hand behind the naturalistic pronouncements made by people like Hawking. Darling wrote, "What is a big deal? The biggest deal of all is how you get something out of nothing. Don't let the cosmologists try to kid you on this one. They have not got a clue either, despite the fact that they are doing a pretty good job of convincing themselves and others that this is really not a problem. In the beginning, they will say, there was nothing, no time, space, matter, or energy. Then there was a quantum fluctuation from which," then Darling adds, "whoa, stop right there. You see what I mean? First there is nothing, and then there is something. And the cosmologists try to bridge the two with a quantum flutter, a tremor of uncertainty that sparks it all off. And then they're away, and before you know it, they've pulled 100 billion galaxies out of their quantum hats." He says, "I don't have a problem with this scenario from the quantum fluctuation onward. Why shouldn't human beings build a theory of how the universe evolved from a simple to a complex state? But there's a very real problem in explaining how it all started in the first place. You can't fudge this by appealing to quantum mechanics. Either there was nothing to begin with, in which case there is no quantum vacuum, no pre-geometric dust, no time in which anything can happen, no physical laws that can affect a change from nothingness to somethingness, or there is something, in which case that needs explaining too." So, end quote. So the long and the short of it is that Hawking admitted that proposals such as his are put forward for aesthetic or metaphysical reasons, but they are not truly scientific because they do not make any predictions, and they cannot be observed, they cannot be corroborated by experimentation, and therefore, as astrophysicist Luke Barnes says, he asks, could a multiverse proposal ever be regarded as scientific? The answer is no, and he explains why. We cannot observe any of the properties of a multiverse, as they have no causal effect on other universes. We could be completely wrong about everything we believe about these other universes, and no observation could correct us. The information is not here. And the history of science has repeatedly taught us that experimental testing is not an optional extra. The hypothesis that a multiverse actually exists will always be untestable, and hence it is non-scientific speculation with not one whit of scientific evidence to corroborate it. And as Philip Johnson points out, the no boundary, no beginning point proposal, quote, is a mathematical construct that has no empirical basis, makes no predictions, and generates no research agenda. Its sole purpose is to support the metaphysical principle that nature is self-contained and effectively eternal, end quote. And to Swedish scientists say, this multiverse hypothesis is not backed up with any empirical support and may be regarded as a rather speculative idea. Further, the whole idea of a naturalistic beginning of the universe is contradicted by the laws and findings of science themselves. First, the first law of thermodynamics is called the law of conservation of energy, and it states that energy of a closed system must remain constant. It can neither increase nor decrease without interference from the outside. Now, the universe is a closed system, so the total amount of energy in existence has always been the same. Now, the second law of thermodynamics states that in converting one form of energy to another, some of that energy is lost as unusable heat. That is known as entropy. Entropy is the thermodynamic quality of randomness or disorder within a system. In other words, the second law of thermodynamics implies that as energy is being transformed throughout the universe, entropy or randomness or disorder is increasing. But any form of naturalism or naturalistic explanation for the existence of the universe means that the universe began in a state of randomness with a terrific explosion, but instead of becoming more random and disordered, as the second law of thermodynamics would indicate, naturalism says that as a result of this gigantic Big Bang explosion, everything progressively became more organized and complex. And therefore, any proposal that the universe exists through naturalistic means is contrary and contradicted by the first and second laws of thermodynamics. In other words, it could not have happened because, remember, it's completely speculative as to what existed when nothing existed before the Big Bang, but after the Big Bang, all of the laws of science, the law of gravity, the first and second laws of thermodynamics came into existence. But the second law of thermodynamics says that as energy is converted and changes occur, not all of that energy is used. Some of it, and so actually randomness and disorder increase. But so that is directly contrary to the idea that the universe began by naturalistic means. There is something else known as the anthropic principle, or fine-tuning of the universe. And that is that there are multiple constants, the gravitational constant, how much gravity exists, strong and weak nuclear forces that have precise values. Various scientists have pointed out, if any one of those constants was off by even 1 part in a million, or in some cases by 1 part in a million, the universe could not have actually come to the point where we see it. Matter would not have been able to coalesce. There would have been no galaxy, stars, planets, or people. And a couple of writers here, they say, it seems impossible that we are here. This fine-tuning, astrophysicist Martin Rees considered just 6 numbers. The relative strength of the electrostatic to the gravitational force between two protons, the fraction of mass converted to energy when hydrogen is fused to form helium, and 4 other constants. Just 6 numbers. And he said, if any one of them were to be untuned, there would be no stars and no life. In short, other scientists point out that there may be 100 fine-tuning parameters, like the panel of controls of the universe, with 100 knobs that have to be set to a certain value. And the chances that the universe should be life-permitting are so infinitesimal as to be incomprehensible and not able to be calculated. Now, Stephen Hawking himself admits that even assuming that the universe was formed through some type of Big Bang or expansion from an infinitesimal point, the initial state of the universe, in terms of its temperature, rate of expansion, etc., must have been very carefully chosen. And it's very difficult to explain why the universe began and exists in the form it does, quote, except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us, end quote. That's Stephen Hawking, the atheist, who believes in, spontaneous generation and multiverses and so on and so forth. And elsewhere, he says that the universe and its laws, quote, appear to have a design that is both tailor-made to support us and, if we are to exist, leaves little room for alteration, end quote. Now, all of this fine-tuning, this has functional significance. As William Dembski says, that these fine-tuned specifications of the universe exhibit an independently recognizable pattern. In other words, what he and others are saying is that the improbable patterns that exhibit functional significance, in other words, these fine-tuned parameters of the universe, they mean something. They are necessary for stars to exist, for human life to exist, for the universe to exist. And what Stephen Meyer points out is that improbable patterns that exhibit functional significance invariably result from intelligent causes, not chance or physical chemical laws. The fine-tuning of the universe, according to Meyer, exhibits precisely those features, extreme improbability and functional specification, that invariably trigger the awareness of and justify an inference to intelligent design. The observation of fine-tuning confirms precisely what we might well expect if a purposive intelligence had acted to design the universe and life. In other words, the existence of the universe, with its fine-tuned parameters, corroborates exactly what the Bible said, that in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. God is the supreme intelligence. And that is corroborated. We can infer the existence of God from the fine-tuned universe, from the second law of thermodynamics, which shows that any random naturalistic process could not possibly have resulted in the life and the universe as we know it. And so, these features can only be explained by an intelligence outside of the universe itself. Now, only theism, and specifically Christianity, can account for this, because theism, Christianity, the Bible, can account for, number one, the origin of the universe in time. In other words, it had a beginning, as scientists themselves have indicated. Number two, only God can account for the fine-tuning of the universe from the beginning of time. And number three, only God can account for the specified information that arises after the beginning of time that is necessary to produce the first living organisms. Now, the naturalistic proposal of the multiverse cannot deal with the question of God's existence and active involvement. One cosmologist and mathematician, George Ellis, points out, scientists propose the multiverse as a way of resolving deep issues about the nature of his existence. But the proposal leaves the ultimate questions unresolved. All the same issues that arise in relation to the universe arise in relation to a multiverse. If a multiverse actually exists, and of course there's no evidence that it does, did it come into existence through necessity, chance, or purpose? That is a metaphysical question that no physical theory can answer for either the universe or the multiverse. In other words, naturalism does not, and naturalistic science does not have the means and cannot answer any of these questions. It can only deal with naturalistic causes. But as we have seen, at every level, the origin of organs, forms, functions, organisms, the origin of mind, the origin of the existence of morality, the existence of life, and the existence of the universe itself. Naturalism not only cannot account for any of these things, but the scientific laws that do exist contradict the idea that any of this came into existence through naturalistic means. The only explanation is that God created the heavens and the earth exactly as the Bible said, and it is God who can account for all of these. In other words, the Bible is consistent with not just some of the facts, but all of the facts, from the existence of the universe itself to the existence of life, to the existence of mind, to the existence of morality, and to the way things are. In the next lecture, we will go and show other areas, namely supernatural experiences and life after death experiences that are all well documented and are completely contrary and contradictory to the idea that all there is material naturalism.